Okay, thank you, everyone, and welcome. My name, for those who don't know me, but saw this as we were announcing on LinkedIn, my name is Caroline Sutton. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for STM, and it is my absolute privilege to welcome all of you to our second webinar in our series called Business Models for a New World. The aim of these webinars is really to try to inspire us to think outside of our current box. We are moving, of course, from an economy that has been based around journals or a monograph in the past, and moving on the journal side to an article-based economy. And of course, one of the early models of that was APCs. But we're also seeing new models emerge, but probably, and this is what the point of this series is, perhaps there's some models out there that we're not even aware of that will actually be there in the future. And so this series is really about inspiring us to think about what some of those models might look like. For those of you who are not aware, our first webinar in this series was held last year with Matt Cockrell, who was, I think, employee number 1 at Biomed Central. So Matt was one of the kind of inventors, as you will, of the APC article processing charge. And so he's now started his own company called CKBK, which is essentially a Spotify of cookbooks. And so if you'd like to take a look at that webinar, it's quite interesting because I talked to Matt about what type of business model he's now introducing around his new business, but equally some of his thoughts about how that is or is not relevant to the scholarly publishing industry, because obviously he worked in our industry for a couple of decades and again had been there during the early days of the APC. Today, we are going to absolutely move outside of our own industry, but to an industry that certainly has a lot for us to learn from, I think. We are joined today, excuse me, I'm just getting all of my notes in order. We're joined today by David Price, who, if you've read the introduction, you will have seen that David is with IFPI, which is an organization that represents the recording industry. And so David's going to be talking with us today about the journey that the music industry has been on in terms of moving towards the digital environment. And we had a pre-talk that was extremely interesting. So with this, I just want to say thank you so much for David for joining us today. I'm going to be giving I'll be giving David the floor for a while, and then we'll also have an opportunity to ask some questions towards the end. If you think of some questions whilst David's talking, please go ahead and put those into the chat, and I'll be sure to facilitate a conversation after David's presentation and to having a conversation with David. So with that, I'd just like to invite David to both unmute and to turn on your camera, David, if you're able to do that. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for the introduction, Caroline. I can't turn on the video, unfortunately, but I do seem to have unmuted myself at least.
David, I'm not hearing you, so I just want to make sure. It looks like you are unmuted, but I'm also not seeing your camera. Let me make sure that we are. Why don't I make you a co-host and see if that happens to help?
Ah, perfect.
There we go. Maybe that'll be better as a co-host. Welcome, David. I'm so sorry about that.
Thank you so much. You can hear me as well, I assume.
I have to say, though, I'm not hearing you.
Oh, very strange.
We've got just a little sound issue here.
It should be coming through. Let me unmute.
Oh, everyone else can hear you. So it's just me. So, goodness, I'm going to have to find out what the issue there is whilst you, why don't I invite you to go ahead, David, and I will see what I can find out here on my end.
Okay. Well, thank you, Caroline. I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, now I can hear you as well. Something. Thanks.
Wonderful. If anyone does have any issues with the video or the audio, please post in the chat and we will try and fix you up as we go along. Delighted to be here. Thank you again for the introduction, Caroline. I want to talk to you a bit about the music industry's experience of this world of the internet, the world of immediate access to music, at any one time. I've got a few slides just to aid a bit of talk over the first 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to share some of those with you, which is hopefully about to happen. There we go. So as I said, I want to go back kind of 15, 20 years, perhaps even a little bit more, to talk a bit about the music industry's experience over the last couple of decades. I was thinking of subtitling this something like "We Made Mistakes So You Don't Have to." I think the music industry was one of the first to really bear the brunt of both the power of the internet and some of the destruction it can cause. But as a result, we were perhaps one of the first to really try and reconfigure the industry in a way that could help us, as well as help music fans and help music artists. So to begin with, just a quick word about IFPI. We are the voice of the recorded music industry worldwide, the trade association, if you like, for the international record labels. Our principal members are the three major record companies: Universal, Warner, Sony, but we also have more than 8,000 individual record companies and labels who are our members worldwide. We tend to work as IFPI mostly through our national group network. So people like BPI in the UK, SNEP in France, IFPI Sweden in Sweden, the ROAA in the US. And we have something like 65 national groups. We have offices dotted around the world, but most of our people are here in London, where I'm talking to you from today. So let me go back all the way to 1999, just as the century was starting to turn, just as the internet was starting to come to people's knowledge and awareness. Back in 99, there were two main ways in which you could listen to music. Most people were out there buying CDs. The industry was making something like about $20 billion a year worldwide, mostly from selling CDs. There was a bit of vinyl going on as well. There were a few associated revenue streams, but the vast bulk was coming from the sales of CDs. $10, $15, maybe $20 or 20 euros, 20 pounds for a CD at that point. But if you weren't buying CDs and you were particularly technologically happy, perhaps you were sat there in university, the way in which you were getting music was through Napster. Napster was really the start at which the music industry started to feel the impact of the internet. Created in someone's college dorm room in 1999 in the States, it very quickly proliferated in use and in popularity. And Napster, if you don't know, was a very simple peer-to-peer program that let you type in the name of a piece of music, an artist, a song, and it would show you all the other people that were connected to Napster that you could download that song from. So whatever you were looking for, it was pretty much out there somewhere. So suddenly you went from having to buy a CD in the shop, or perhaps just listening to the radio and hoping the song you liked came on, to being able to download and obtain any piece of music you wanted for free. Now, obviously, as far as the industry was concerned, and as far as all the laws are concerned, that's copyright infringement. So the way in which the industry responded to that might be as you'd expect. So if you like, business model number one for coping with the internet, as far as the music industry was concerned, was let's protect the legacy business. Let's protect what we currently have, these sales of CDs. And we did that by throwing a whole bunch of lawyers at Napster. And what happened is that Napster very quickly closed down. And it was very quick in terms of the response time. Napster was launched back end of 1999. By July 2020, we already had a ruling in the US court saying that Napster was liable for copyright infringement. They were ordered to implement some filtering technology. And as soon as that technology was installed, people left the network because they couldn't download the copyrighted music that they wanted, and Napster was dead. That picture there is actually the Napster homepage from, I think, early in 2021, when the network and the company finally closed down. So Napster's symbol, its logo was a cat, a sleeping cat. So they called it Dead Kitty in this wonderful piece of MS Paint art that you can see there. So first solution for how we deal with the internet, try and keep the legacy business, sue the bad guys, stop the bad guys. It's one solution, certainly worked for Napster. The problem is that we probably underestimated the power of the technological and cultural tidal wave that was hitting all industries, all businesses, all nations at the same time. And that was the power, obviously, of the internet. It has completely changed our lives. It has changed how every business operated. But at the time, back in 2000, maybe we couldn't see and couldn't quite understand just how much power that was going to have in its impact on every aspect of life. The problem we faced is that, yes, Napster closed down, but Napster was replaced by this, and by this, by all of these, and by these. And these guys came along. There were tens, hundreds, probably thousands of different peer-to-peer networks, websites, modes of finding pirated music very, very easily and very, very quickly. These are our current bugbears, stream ripping websites. You can go to any of these websites, you can give it a YouTube URL, and they'll download you an MP3 of the music being played on that video. Very quick, very easy, very difficult to shut down, unfortunately, but a huge impact still on the music industry's ability to properly sell content. So piracy has evolved over time, and I really want to go back and just focus on that first 10, 15 years of music piracy. I don't want this presentation to be entirely about piracy. I'm going to move on to talking about other areas in a minute, but I think it's really important just to look at the impact this had on the industry going forward. So I'm just going to stop this revenue chart at about 2014 or so, because that's the point at which things started a little bit to level out and stabilize. But you'll see back in 1999 and 2000, we were about a $22 billion industry in terms of revenues flowing into our record companies each year. So by 2014, things looked very different. This is the revenue we were getting from streaming. So we're talking about things like Spotify, like YouTube. So very small, very nascent, and still a very minor part of overall revenues. We had revenues coming in from downloads, things like iTunes sales. But the biggest part of the industry still, in 2014 even, was physical sales, CDs, vinyl. They were still the largest single part of our revenue, even 15 years after Napster had come along and kind of indicated where the future was going. We were still reliant on CD revenue and sales of physical content for the bulk of the material coming in to the music industry. A few other smaller parts of revenue, performance rights, so money when music's played on the radio or played in a restaurant, for instance, and sync when it's when music's twinned with a TV commercial or similar. But the bulk of the money at that point was still physical content. So we had a few attempts, as I mentioned, at kind of different business plans. During that, we had the launch of iTunes in 2004, where we went from selling albums primarily to selling just discrete downloads. You could buy single MP3s, you could buy the whole album if you wanted, which helped. It helped temper that decline in physical, but it never really replaced it. And then we started to see very slowly impacts from streaming. We had the first deal with YouTube, which at the time was a relatively small website in 2006. Warner took a deal with it, a very small limited deal in 2006. Then finally, we had the launch of Spotify, 2008. Now, it's only launched in Sweden, a couple of Nordic countries. And at the time, it was a small, scrappy startup that few people had heard of. But let's go back now, and I just want to focus very much on that bottom line of streaming revenue. So what we see over time, and I'm going to run this up to about 2014 again, is a very gradual growth in the use and popularity and the revenues from streaming coming into the music industry. It was a very gradual growth, despite the level of perhaps consumer interest in this that was indicated by things like Napster and the other file sharing services that were out there. Things were still very, very slow to get going. By 2014, we had about $1 billion or so coming in from streaming, but that's within a $14–15 billion industry. So still a relatively small portion. We only had about 28 million subscribers worldwide, people who were paying for Spotify Premium or other subscription music services. But this is the point where things finally really started to take off. 2015, for instance, was the point I usually see as being the moment when streaming of music really entered the public consciousness. Apple Music launched in a huge blaze of publicity, and people other than really early adopters started to hear about music streaming. They started to understand how it worked, what was on offer, what the value proposition was. £10, €10 a month, and you get every piece of music there is. So that started to feed into people's lives. It started to feed into how they were living their lives with new technologies, with changes in data costs. And this was the point where revenue from streaming and the number of people involved in streaming really started to grow. We had Amazon Music launch in 2016. We had a bunch of other services try to stake a claim. By 2018, we had about 250 million subscribers. So subscribers had gone up by about 10 times in 5 years up to 2018. And then by 2022, by last year, we're now up to almost 600 million people paying for music, paying for that subscription to Spotify or Apple or Deezer or Amazon or Tidal or QQ Music or QO or Melon or one of the many streaming services that are out there. And it's now an industry worth almost $18 billion just from streaming. So, that change, as you can see, happened very, very, very slowly until it happened very, very quickly all of a sudden. And it took a long time for that to really feed through to what people wanted, what people were looking for, but also in the willingness of the industry to go all in on this, their ability to strike deals with DSPs and the ability to find the right value proposition for the labels and the artists. So there's still some questions to be asked about streaming. It's not necessarily the final answer here. What happens when we reach the audience ceiling in mature markets? How do we lay the groundwork for new markets? So there's a lot of questions there, and I'm happy to maybe dive into some of those during the discussion. But let's go back for a moment to that initial revenue chart I showed you and just go all the way forward to 2022. And you can see again that massive impact that streaming really had on the music industry. From 2014, where it was worth just over $1 billion, we're now up to almost $18 billion a year flowing through from streaming. Downloads have really shrunk again. Physical has proved to be actually stronger than most people thought, quite resilient. And we're actually seeing an increase in things like vinyl sales now. CD sales increased last year as well. So, and then performance rights and singles, so delivering slightly more revenue year on year. So this is, in a sense, a streaming success story, but it's also important just to look at that in terms of real value. If you were to factor inflation into this chart, even though we're now a $26 billion industry in 2022, that's probably, with inflation built in, much lower than a $23 billion industry in 1999. So there has been a huge impact here. But things are obviously looking a lot more promising now than they were 10 years ago. So I want to just touch for a moment on some of the conditions that were necessary for this streaming growth to occur. That both growth in revenues, both growth in consumer adoption of it. First two of those are things that, as an industry, we have very, very little control over. The internet infrastructure. In particular, the cost of internet infrastructure, the cost of broadband, the cost of data on your phone. Those things are incredibly important to the take-up of streaming services and the continued popularity of those services. Hardware. You know, the iPhone didn't launch until 2007, and smartphones weren't in that point of mass adoption for at least 5 years after that. Now, there is a very, very close relationship between someone's propensity to own a smartphone and their propensity to have a streaming music service. It makes perfect sense. If you've got your phone with you, you've got access to any piece of music in the world at any time. So that's an incredible part of that value proposition of streaming. But then there's things that the industry itself, the music industry, really does have more control over. And the first of those is a willingness to engage with services, to license them, and assume a lot of the risk. Just to touch on Spotify again, I think I called it a scrappy startup in 2008. It wasn't just that. The main programmer of Spotify in 2008 was a guy who the year before had been the main programmer of the biggest and most popular BitTorrent client. BitTorrent, as you all know, is one of the biggest aspects of piracy across the world. A guy called Ludwig Strigius, he'd written a client called uTorrent, incredibly popular, really easy to use. Daniel Ek spotted his talents as a coder and brought him in to help program the Spotify app. And this is when Spotify had like 5 employees. So you can see how record labels coming to this company and starting to talk to them are going to be a little bit reticent about this. Are they willing to take that risk, license their music to a program that at the time was still using peer-to-peer methods and was at least partially involved with all of the BitTorrent activity that had been going on a few years before? So there's a big risk there, particularly when you're dealing with an industry whose legacy business is all about shipping physical CDs. But the industry has taken that risk. They've taken that jump. They are willing to license and engage with people. And I think that experience with companies like Spotify have helped do that. We see much, much, much more willingness amongst record companies now to take those jumps, those leaps of faith with new platforms and new services than we were seeing 10, 15 years ago. It's obviously necessary to have that continued investment in artists and technology. The recorded music industry is one of the biggest investors in research and development in A&R across the world, across any kind of industry. And you've got to keep the new artists flowing. You've got to adapt with the sort of services that are out there. You've got to make sure that you are bringing new artists, developing new artists, and providing the sort of music that people want to hear. There's got to be the right policy framework. This is one of the big jobs of IFPI, is making sure that wherever we are dealing with music, wherever governments and bodies like the EU, for instance, are involved with new laws that are anything to do with the internet or to do with copyright, we are there representing the interests of the music industry. This is particularly the case in new markets. One of our big focuses over the last 5 years or so has been identifying those new markets and working to ensure that the right laws are on the books, implemented in the right way. So when it comes to rapidly growing markets like China, like India, and markets with huge potential like Indonesia, like Nigeria, we're there working with our national groups to put the right laws, to encourage governments to recognize the importance of copyright and the importance of other sorts of laws which help lay the right framework for our companies to do business. And it's also really important, this goes back, I think, to what I was talking about with Napster, about recognizing consumer need and consumer want. Ultimately, we are built on what music listeners and music fans want to listen to and how they want to listen to it. That's where the bulk of our revenues is coming from. And we've got to understand what consumers want. So I'm going to show you a few slides from what we call our music consumer study. This is one of my big projects each year. We talk to somewhere between 40 to 50,000 music listeners worldwide to try and understand what they're listening to, how they're listening to it, how they feel about things, what their music habits are. So one of the first things I'm going to show you is just what's important to people about streaming services. When someone is paying for Spotify Premium or for Apple Music, what's important to them about that service? What makes them fork out their €10, $10 a month to get access to all of that music? And what we find is that it is the music that they really want. It's those millions of tracks. It's the ability to listen without interruption. It's the ability to have that music experience where they want it and when they want it and how they want it. Whatever device, wherever they are, they want to be able to have all their music at their fingertips, that convenience and ease of use. So it's mostly about the music that has been licensed to the service rather than the service proposition itself. The value stems from the access to all of that music. And when we ask people how they search for music and what they're looking for, how do you find music on Spotify or Apple Music? It's what people are searching for. They're not guided to it by Spotify's recommendation algorithm. It's more that they are searching for it themselves. So it's the power of the music that's driving the success of this more than it is the particular features that something like Spotify might have. A couple more slides before I finish. One of the things that we also ask about is about music engagement, the amount of time people spend listening to music through different methods. And I said I didn't want to make the presentation all about piracy. I also don't want to make it all about streaming, because one of the most important things that the industry has tried to do over the last 5 or 6, maybe even 10 years is give music to people in the way they want it, where they want it, how they want it. And that doesn't just mean through a streaming service. It can mean helping them engage with music through as many different methods as possible. So we ask people how much time they spend listening to music each week. And on average, across, I think, 22 different countries, 44,000 people last year, across all of those people, we found that they were listening to, on average, just over 20 hours of music a week, so about 3 hours a day. And when you break it down, you realize just how diverse the listening experience often is. So about a quarter of all music listening time, just under 5 hours a week on average, is done through subscription streaming services. So that's Spotify Premium or Apple Music or one of the other paid levels, paid tiers of streaming services. We see it just under another 10% through the ad-supported tiers. So listening to Spotify with adverts interrupting your music listening. Video streaming, which in most countries just means YouTube, is very important to music consumption. Then short form video, primarily that means TikTok outside of China and India. But TikTok didn't really exist 3 years ago as part of people's music lives. The pandemic changed that, and now we see this incredibly important ecosystem working to perform a range of tasks within the music industry. Social media is important, and then the old stage of radio. Radio's been there since 1920 something, but is still providing music to people, particularly in Europe, where it's incredibly popular. But still, 3.5 hours a week on average, people are spending listening to radio. The older you are, the more you tend to listen to the radio and the less you tend to listen to streaming services. But radio is still very important to people's music lives. We have purchased music like CDs, like vinyl, people still listening there, live music and various other sorts. But the consequence of all of this, this striving to give people music however they want it, I'm going to come on to a couple of other methods in a second, is that most people think that we are in a bit of a golden age almost here. That 77% agreed that there are more ways to listen to music than ever before. And if I look at that pie chart there, that listening pie, all of those streaming methods, short form video, social media, I didn't have those when I was growing up. I would have loved to be able to listen to any music, but I was stuck with the radio, CDs, a bit of vinyl, and that was it, going out to gigs every now and again. So this ability now, all of these streaming services have really revolutionized music access for most people. And it's not just this where we stop, because we're now in a situation where things are in a state, if you like, of constant evolution. Your record labels are constantly looking for new opportunities for artists and new ways in which fans can engage with music and with artists. So it's not just things like merchandise and brand partnerships, sponsorships, endorsements, which things that have always kind of been there at one level or another, but we're looking at short form video, musical adaptations, long form video and film, films, documentaries, TV shows that feature more and more music, in-game content, not just soundtracks of FIFA or whatever game you might want to play, but actual virtual reality concerts within platforms like Fortnite and Roblox, giving people completely new ways to engage with artists. Live streaming came very popular during the pandemic and has proved another enduring aspect of what happened during COVID, during lockdown. People are still accessing live streams of music. Then we have things like NFTs and the metaverse. Now, their time probably came and went very, very quickly. But again, the industry was prepared to work with companies in this area, and they still are, willing to license content to companies here to see, are there opportunities here for our artists? Are there opportunities for giving people ways to engage with music through these new methods? Okay, I've got two very quick final slides, skip over those stats, just to highlight some of the current policy issues that we face as a trade organization in particular. First of those is what we talked about from the very beginning, which is piracy and unlicensed content. We are constantly looking at this. It is a huge part of IFPI's role, and our task is to locate these unlicensed services. It is to work out ways of dealing with them. It is to find out how this landscape is constantly changing. Stream ripping at the moment, mobile apps, all of these are very high up our agenda. We are constantly working with policymakers, with intermediaries, to try and stop as much of this taking place as possible. We're looking at new things like streaming fraud, the ability to buy fake plays on things like Spotify or Apple Music or YouTube to be able to drive things up the charts, or even try to make money from fake plays of content. And the biggest issue that we're working on right at the moment is the thing that I'm actually quite surprised I've managed not to mention so far, which is artificial intelligence. This is obviously a huge concern for all industries at the moment, but particularly for the music industry, we're concerned about a number of areas. One of those is music which sounds like an artist. There was a fake Drake track around a few weeks ago, but it's now very easy for almost anyone to make a piece of music that sounds like Drake, Taylor Swift, Rihanna, Eminem, the Beatles, you name it. It's not hard to train an AI to recognize the musical styles of a particular artist, and then to make new music or make covers of of previously existing music that sounds just like that artist. Obviously, we consider that simple infringement, and we want to make sure that that is clamped down on as much as possible. Our focus is on making sure that that permission is sought and that a license can be freely negotiated if the artist and if the rights holder chooses to give a license. It's under their control whether they license their material at all. We also want to make sure there's transparency in terms of what AIs have been trained on and how they use that material. And we want to emphasize things like human creativity, the part that the fact that humans are so important to that musical process and the unique emotions that are communicated through a piece of music. Okay, so very quickly wrapping all that up, returning to this idea of business models. We started, I guess, with this ownership business model of physical, of selling CDs, selling bits of vinyl. We moved slightly, we pivoted a bit when piracy started to hit with selling downloads. But again, we're talking ownership. We're talking selling discrete downloads as singles or albums. People could buy them and keep them. We then moved again, pivoted to a system of music, of selling access to music through streaming services. We began by looking at paid subscriptions, ad-supported tiers, streaming through video sites, and then that changed again and evolved more. And we looked at streaming through social media sites, through short-form video platforms like TikTok. And we're constantly looking to see where streaming of music might have an impact going forward. And then there's even further models based on engagement and more offering users an experience, listeners an experience to interact with their artists or engage with music in different ways. Fitness platforms, gaming platforms like Fortnite, things like NFTs, the metaverse. And obviously you'll all have seen Apple's VR headset announced a couple of days ago. Again, the ability to use that for music access is going to be incredibly important. Live concerts or music videos are going to be a huge part of that. So we need to make sure that we're understanding what the issues are there, and our companies are also involved as much as possible in making sure that the right framework is there for them to be able to license their content. Okay, I've gone through a huge amount in a very short period of time. I've probably run over the 20 minutes or so that I should have been allotted, but there's a lot to get through. More than happy to take any questions or just to get involved in a general discussion, either about the music industry's experience, perhaps about the lessons that might be there to help your own businesses.
Thank you so much, David. This has been absolutely fascinating. I'm wondering if I might ask a couple of questions that are a bit broad, and then we've got a couple of AI questions that are coming up in the chat right now. So I do want to make sure we get to that. But I'm just curious, so I think in our industry, the shift to digital and some of the demands that are kind of emerging from the market in various locations are also in some ways challenging our thinking about what's our role in the value chain that we've been engaged with. And I just wonder, was there also a type of, that type of conversation that had to go on in the music industry too? I mean, what is the role of music producers? If before it was both producing and distributing, and now there were others that started to distribute in a different way, or do you feel that it's just added on to things you're already doing?
No, that's a very good question. We certainly face those issues and have faced them in the past. With regard to distribution, for instance, there was always a concern, well, if it was £15 to buy a CD, which you had to physically manufacture, and here it is in my hands, why isn't it cheaper to get a digital download? Not really understanding the costs that are involved in all of the creating the MP3s in various different quality formats, sending them all out, creating the technologies that are required to do all that, the work that we have to do with different platforms and different DSPs. So there's always a question around that. But I think probably the bigger question is about where the responsibility lies for the success of music consumption, whether that's related to individual artists or albums, or in a sense, the recovery of the industry and the recovery of our revenues. We always see that the platforms, the DSPs, the digital service providers are very quick to say, this artist was a success on our platform, we're responsible for that. Whereas we as the record industry say, well, no, we're responsible for that because we invested in that artist. We brought their music to you. All you've done is really provide an access portal to that particular artist and their music. So there's always an argument there between, the ability of people to access music through the platforms and the platform taking responsibility. Whereas the industry likes to say, well, we are the people making those investments in our artists. We're helping them create their music. We're bringing the music simply to you, and you're taking credit simply for providing the ability for someone to type in the name and listen to their music. So that's, I think, an ongoing debate, recognizing the value of who's bringing that music and who's creating the popularity for that music in the first place.
Very interesting. And I think related to that, I think you've already started touching on it. Someone asked, what do you think the lessons are for B2B versus B2C? Yeah, I don't know if you've had any thoughts about that.
It's a good question. I think in terms of B2B, we'd probably be looking more at our relationships with the platforms. And, as a trade organization, that's not something we can ever get involved in. But I think what we do see is that we've gone from having a very wide range of partners in the physical world. We had a whole bunch of retailers who would sell our music. We had a whole bunch of radio stations that we could go to try and promote music. There's a whole bunch of TV stations that we would try to use as record companies. We now have a much smaller number of very, very large DSPs that we have, that our companies have very strong relationships with. So that's a different way of negotiating value and negotiating licenses. And I think it requires very different skills. In terms of delivering music to the consumer, I mean, it's been turned on its head. We go from the ability to buy a single CD to the ability to have every piece of music in your pocket for cheaper than you would pay for a CD 20 years ago. That's an incredibly different value proposition for most users. I think we often say that the music industry of today is completely unrecognizable to what we saw 20 odd years ago. And I think that's the case. All of those relationships have been rethought, have been reconfigured. And the way in which the industry works is unrecognizable to something from 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Even though I'm someone who in my home, we have a very large vinyl collection. I just realized I should have sat in that room with that background for you. I was also asking, and I think this relates in part to what you're just talking about, because of course, there are also the artists themselves and the creators of the music. And how do you, in this new environment where I'm assuming there's a real pressure on the price for streaming to be very, very low. It's a global market, so everybody across the world's got to be able to buy it. And how do we then make sure that the creators on the other end are being amply, recuperated for their efforts as well in all of this?
This is a major issue, and I think what you've seen is that for most artists, for people who remember, how they used to release music 20 years ago, you would release a single, you'd release another single, you'd release an album, and then you'd go on tour on the back of that album. So your sales were very much focused on that initial release of your album. So you'd have a huge spike in revenue over a very short period of time of 2 or 3 months. You'd go on tour, you'd get revenue from your touring income, and you'd understand how you could allocate that revenue over time for you to then make your next album and so on and so on. Streaming is completely different to that. Streaming is a much slower but more consistent revenue flow over a long period of time. You're no longer getting that initial 10 or 15 pounds every time a CD is bought. You're getting some revenues in from your streaming of your new content when it's released. But then the hope is, and the reality is, that you get a lot more consistent revenue and recurring revenue from your older catalog and that album over time as people are streaming it. But it's very difficult often for artists to make that switch. And we do recognize that there are a lot of performers who are being recompensed in completely different ways to what they're used to. So the industry has had to do a lot of work on things like transparency in making sure that they're talking to the artists and they understand this, and just getting people used to these new business models, these new ways of people being paid. Artist groups are very concerned about the ability to develop new artists. Record companies think that's still a job that they are very strong on and very deemed very important. But there are obvious concerns there. The streaming business model doesn't necessarily work for every single group of artists that are out there. And I think we need to constantly have those conversations with our artist groups and with our DSPs to make sure that those the people are being properly recompensed. I mean, what we do see is that over time, more and more of the money that record companies make as a percentage is being returned to the artists. We've seen a lot of older artists have very poor contracts that they might have been under completely rewritten so that they benefit much more from the digital environment. So It is very difficult. There's a lot of tricky arguments there, but it's obviously we want to make sure that artists are properly remunerated and that artists are getting as much money as they possibly can, because that's what all of our success is based on.
Yeah. And I know that we'd said this was a 45-minute session. I'm wondering if you have a few more minutes just for a few more, because I think this is such an interesting conversation that I recognize there may be a few people who are joining that might have to drop off. But I want to give a chance for a few more questions. I thought too, it was really interesting because the piracy, streaming fraud, AI, those are absolutely things that we in our industry are also facing and trying to understand what do we do about them. Similar to Napster, we've had Sci-Hub come and take content. One of my questions to you was going to be, once you started engaging with streaming, did you see the piracy disappear? But I think you've answered the question that no, because in your presentation, you talked about that that is still an avenue that you're having to pursue, despite, I would argue, that the cost of accessing music via streaming is quite low. As you say, contra, when you had to go and you purchased a whole album and are, as a consumer, probably paying less and getting more for the money. One of the questions I have is more from my own sort of perspective as leading a trade association and thinking about, I'm in the midst of an industry that is, being disrupted. We're looking for new business models. It was very interesting, I thought, that you noted that not all artist music is suited to streaming, because I think we're also trying to, in our space, figure out, is it really one model that's going to fit everybody? Everybody would love that to be the case, but that doesn't look to be the case. I am curious in terms of ushering in these new business models as streaming was emerging. Did I understand correctly that it started with a few of the big actors daring to sign some agreements with some of these distributors or streaming services? And was it then, I'm just curious how the industry moved as an industry then, so that you start to get these emerging models starting to stick. And I suppose there were other things that disappeared, but I'm trying to understand, how do we help an industry move forward? But I can't go out and tell people, here's the one you all need to adopt, because that would be illegal of me. That would be, yeah. So I'm just curious how that all happened when you look back.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it was quite a slow process. The most of the period of the 2000s was a huge shock to the system, because revenues were decreasing every single year. We saw piracy becoming more and more and more of an issue. And yes, I think, compared to 15 years ago, piracy is probably a lot lower than it used to be, but it's still a major issue, particularly in a lot of developing markets for us. But in terms of the evolution of the different models, I think you're right when you say that there were lots of attempts. There were lots of services out there who all had similar-ish ideas. There was a streaming service called Rhapsody, which appeared in 2003 or so. It was very shortly after Napster, which was a licensed service, but it didn't have much music on it, and it was quite slow. And, almost the time wasn't right. The technology wasn't quite there to give people the success they wanted. So, that willingness to take a leap with services like Spotify, it takes a lot of discussion between the rights holders and our companies and a platform like Spotify. It takes trials in countries like Sweden and Norway. Sweden was ideal. I mean, Sweden had been decimated by content piracy in the 2000s. They had incredibly good internet speeds. There was the Pirate Bay based in that country. People were just used to pirating stuff. So Spotify comes along and says, look, let's try it here. What are you going to lose? There's almost not much revenue coming into the country right now. Let's see where we get to here. So, Daniel Ek is very persuasive. He had some good relationships with record company execs there. They decided to go ahead. That blossomed into more countries over time. It took them, 3 or 4 years before they could launch in the US. They've constantly gone to sign up more record companies. So it's been very gradual, and it's been, I guess, the consumer driving that in terms of, we do the trial with Spotify. It proves to be very popular. We expand it out. It proves to be popular in other markets apart from Sweden and Norway and others. And gradually it extends, across the world, whether that's through Spotify or through a different DSP. So, it did take a lot of experimentation, but it took the right kind of foundations as well. So talking about internet speeds, data costs, all of that. It has to be at the right kind of moment for these things to reach a public level where they're acceptable.
You know what, I find that very hopeful because there are a lot of people in our space who have been pushing for open access. So that is, no barriers, no subscription barriers to accessing research articles and to some extent monographs. Just celebrating the 20th anniversary of what's called the Budapest Open Access Initiative, which, declared that a new era was coming. And we've been saying, but a lot's been happening actually. Like now over half of the content that we're putting out there is freely available, but there's like this, but it's going too slow by those who are wanting this movement to happen. But we're trying to move as fast as the customers are demanding it across the globe, but equally, we're trying to find what's going to be the right business model so that actors, big, small, and otherwise, aren't going to disappear in this transition. So knowing that it took the music industry quite a while to kind of get to where you are now gives me some hope that it's not because we are all putting in the effort here and trying to find that way forward. But it's hard work. It's challenging to find the way.
And it's particularly challenging when you have the pace of technological development, which is out there for everybody. We'd look at the last 2 years, there's been NFTs, there's been the metaverse, there's now AI, there's been all the crypto things, there's VR coming down the line. Where do you put your resources to try and best understand how to deliver music in the best way for the artist and the best way for people to access it and listen to it?
Right. Oh, David, I know that you and I had a prep call for this, and just in that prep call, we realized we really ought to have more conversations. I know that Claudia Russo is in touch with your organization otherwise, but I really do want to follow up because I have many more questions. Some of them are very specific questions, some of them are broad, but I think that there are, as you say, some lessons and some commonalities, and not least as our industries are now facing AI. And the challenges that that's bringing. And I'm sure that we're going to be grappling with that together. Someone just wanted me to ask very quickly, though, because I see they put this in there twice. What's the best AI tool for music? I don't know if you're wanting people to use an AI tool for music, if that question is about to create.
It depends what you're looking for. If you're looking for music creation, there are hundreds of different tools out there that will help you. Most of them feature AI at some level or another. These are not tools which are new to the music industry. It's been interesting. We're doing our big consumer study at the moment, and we've asked ChatGPT to generate some questions for us about people's perceptions of AI music, and it's actually proved quite helpful for that. They're probably questions we'd have asked anyway, but it does show the power of these sorts of tools. I think the best AI tool for music is probably yet to be written, and it's probably something which, given the growth in the power of AI, we might need to be a bit scared of.
Oh, well, thank you, David. And there was so much in this talk. So just to share with everyone, we will be, this has been recorded and we'll be posting the video. So again, I want to thank David for joining us today. And thanks for everyone for joining. It's really given me so much to think about. And I see an incredible number of parallels here. So thanks again, David. And again, thanks to everybody for joining. And we'll be setting up a new webinar soon.
Thank you for the opportunity. Good to talk to you all today.
Goodbye. Thanks, David. Take care.